I'm James Stevens from Pedersen. For those of you who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting either in person or virtually before, we're doing a webinar today. We've called it Under the Microscope. We're talking about the evolution of chemicals policy and regulation, and we've decided to focus on something that's been flagged in the Green Deal communication at the end of last year, and certainly been mentioned in the chemicals strategy for sustainability roadmap, and indeed in recent days around the place. That's one substance, one assessment. I think it's fair to say that there's not going to be a lot of disagreement that we want, that people do not want less coherence, less consistency, and less predictability. Hard, I think, for anyone on the panel to argue that. So we've invited a panel of people here today to talk about what does that one substance, one assessment actually mean? What do we want from it? What are the likely kind of barriers that we're going to face to get it? And actually, are there any kind of disadvantages of moving down that road? Okay, so joining me here today, I have Director Bruijn, who's a director at ECHA, of course, responsible for prioritization and integration. Been at ECHA since its foundation, 2007 time, played a role as Director of Risk Management as well in the past. And of course, I'm sure many people that are calling in or watching in from around Europe probably also know him from his time at the ECB at the JRC as well. So been knocking around chemicals policies for many years. Delighted to have you with us, Jack. We also have Hans Meyer from the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructure and Environment, but also has a role at ECHA in terms of being a member of their management board. So two hats today for Hans. Again, looking at Hans' CV, I'm sure many of you have known him or have met him in various guises over the years. Not only have spent time in Dutch ministries, but also I noted in your career, Hans, you also spent time at the Commission, albeit on perhaps wider climate and transport issues rather than chemicals. Coming from our industry side, we have two speakers, one of whom works across the chemical policy and regulatory area, Violaine Verougstraete from Eurometaux, which of course is the Non-Ferrous Metals Association at a European level, where she is Director of Chemicals. I'm also joined by Kevin Bradley, who is the Secretary General of BSEC, which is the International Bromine Council, the representative body of producers of bromine in Europe and indeed around the world, with chapters in various locations. Kevin here based in Brussels. So they are our four speakers. We're going to, for those of you who don't know, there is chat functionality if this is the time first time you've joined us. If you look to the right of the screen, feel free to post questions in chat. I'll be able to see them and I will post them to our panelists as we go along. We've also got a poll because the whole virtual experience allows us to do interesting and wonderful things. So the poll is open and I'll give the results of that poll at the end of the first round of interventions, and we'll try and keep it a little bit dynamic. So I thought we'd start with Jack. Jack, we've seen, I know ECHA has done a lot of work and a lot of thinking about one substance, one assessment, rightly so. I mean, you're kind of at the heart of it, together with other agencies like EFSA. I'd just be interested from your perspective, from an ECHA perspective, in the heart of some of these processes, clearly already starting to involve other processes, so biocides in recent years, the risk assessment part on the worker safety. How do you see this one substance, one assessment debate, and what are the kind of things that you think we need to be thinking about?
Okay, thanks, and thanks for inviting me. I hope you can hear me well. Yes, okay, good. Yeah, indeed, as you say, we are indeed at the heart of this process and this idea. I must say, when we first heard this term surfacing a lot, actually over the last maybe half year or a bit longer than that, we were quite interested. Indeed, we have been involved in a number of areas where we have already been looking at possible, let's say, closer interaction between different processes, also really trying to see if merging of certain activities could take place. So we were quite interested. At the same point in time, the term is a very interesting one and politically sounds very nice and easy, and that's fine, that's good. But the reality is, of course, always a little bit more complicated. And this is the reason why, indeed, when we saw this being mentioned in the Green Deal, we decided to work together with our colleagues in EFSA to start analyzing the issue in a bit more detail and see, okay, what does it actually mean? What would it mean for us where do we see the major issues or problems which could be worked on, and can we perhaps think of solutions? And without going into, let's say, too much detail, because I'm sure we're going to come to some of the points later in the discussion, I think we see two main areas to work on. One is what I would say more coordination of activities at policy level, because what we see and what we've seen over the years is that quite often we see divergences or diverging opinions or assessments being done simply because of the scope of the work which was put forward as a result of the legislation in which the work was done, or sometimes simply because of timing. And I think one of the things which we can do together with Commission services in particular is look at the overall, let's say, planning of activities, scope of activities, mandates given to committees, agencies in terms of the assessments, and see that these could be better coordinated. And then secondly, there are a number of areas, of course, if you look more into the detail of how the assessments are done, data analysis, rules for data selection, methodologies on risk assessment, hazard assessment, where of course between the regulatory agencies, but also some of the committees doing that work, there could be further, let's say, discussions and convergence of activities. And I think without going to the detail because of time, these are the two main elements which we've identified to be further worked on and clarified in the course of the activity. Maybe I stop here.
Thank you, Jack, for that introductory comments. I'm sure, as you say, we'll come back to both the data aspect of it and the work between the different committees and agencies, but also that coordination at a policy level. Let me bring in Kevin on that point, actually. So Kevin, you're at the kind of sharp end of this, right? So you represent producers with specific substances that have undergone or undergoing lots of different processes, sometimes at the same time. So I'm kind of interested in your perspective. I'm guessing that first point that Jack mentioned about the coordination between those different policies and processes is dear to your heart, let's say. Kevin, what do you think?
Great. James, thank you for that, and also thank you for organizing this webinar. I think it's good as we sort of start the broader debate about what one substance, one assessment means. I do take Jack's point there that it'll be interesting to see how we sort of clarify what rolls off the tongue very well and very easily, but when you stop and think about it, what actually does it mean in practice? But just to come to your question, yeah, we have been at the sharp end of this actually, and we've have two particular situations. Unfortunately, one of them I won't be able to discuss in any great detail because it's sub judice. We're taking an action before the European Court of Justice, and that relates to a ban on halogenated flame retardants, which arose just literally for us out of the blue. In the context of an eco-design requirements for electronic displays. However, sort of more in the sort of, I would call in the world of assessments, and this is back to Jack's point, I think we have actually got right now an overlapping situation in relation to one of our substances, which is going through a REACH evaluation, has been since 2017. The testing phase is nearly finished, the results to be delivered towards the end of the year, and then the conclusion, if there can be a conclusion from the evaluation process, then sometime in 2021. Concurrent with that is an assessment under RoHS, going on under RoHS. Now, you can sort of say, well, RoHS is a different instrument, and therefore it's entitled to pick up substances and assess them, and I don't dispute that. The problem arises when the two overlap, and then when you start to look at some of the conclusions that come from the assessment under RoHS, and you say, hold on a second. First of all, they're making a proposal here which is based on information for which we're going to have the results next year. So, that doesn't add up to us. I think I'm not going to blame anybody here. I'm just going to say that this is a practical example of why we do need to move to one substance, one assessment. It may be that it's going to be a journey Jack has mentioned some points there. I think he's right. There's a political coordination. I agree with that. And then there's the methodological side. We've had experiences of that. We see, on the one hand, we see REACH with its robust processes, very clear organizational structures for dealing with assessments, robust methodologies which have been discussed and agreed with stakeholders. And then on the other side, yes, a methodology under RoHS, but one that has been put together and then, put to one side because the consultants didn't actually follow the methodology which they described. So certainly we need to see something there. And I also would say this, and I'll come back to it later, is that some of this is going to be long-term, but I think there are some medium-term things that we can address to bring about some better coordination, and I'm happy to talk about those later.
Thank you, Kevin. Jack, I'm just checking that you can hear me, even if you can't hear Kevin particularly well. No.
You, but I can't hear Kevin at all.
Very bizarre. Kevin, we could hear you. Everyone else could hear you.
Okay, then it's my problem.
I mean, we're going to come back in the debate, hopefully, but just to pick up on some of the things that Kevin did say. So we were talking about an example, Jack, where we got a RoHS process going at the same time as a substance evaluation, and that the data from the substance evaluation may affect the RoHS process, but it's not being taken into account. And I think 3 bits that I picked up from you, Kevin, there. So one was the data issue. We're generating data under REACH, which is not then being taken into account in a different process. Secondly, I heard one question about sequencing there, which I guess, Jack, comes back to your point about how do we plan this properly? Great idea, one substance, one evaluation, but there's certainly many examples over the years of things where you think the sequencing just doesn't seem right? We seem to be running things either in parallel or in the wrong order. And then I think a bit of praise there for ECHO, I'd say, or at least for the REACH regulation, and the fact that we like to praise ECHO, clearly, especially with a management board member and a member of staff on the line. The robustness of the processes and the way that the processes under ECHO work in terms of how things are deliberated and the opportunity for people to have a good discussion. We're not going to say it's perfect, but we're going to, I think what Kevin was saying, it seems like the right kind of direction of travel for what one might expect in this kind of process. Actually, at that point, I took to Violaine, your kind of view, you don't just see, individual substances, you see a whole raft of substances. Someone said to me the other day that actually in terms of volume, inorganics and therefore metals are the largest volume of chemicals that go through the REACH regulation, which surprised me somewhat because I just didn't. Sometimes one thinks of REACH regulation, and I certainly didn't think naturally of metals. So I guess you see a lot of this in your work. Can you give us your kind of view from a more horizontal perspective? And we've touched a little bit on data, a little bit on risk assessment, and we probably wandered into a little bit on risk management. So I don't know if you want to touch upon any of those.
Yeah, thank you, James. Yeah, indeed, in terms of volumes, we represent a big share in the registered substances, also in terms of hazards, I think. So that's why we're quite interested as well to streamline the processes. So overall, I really think that we welcome a move towards more streamlining and more simplification. We see that as a way, of course, to increase the efficiency, the robustness of the assessments, ensure that when you have different assessments carried out on the same data sets, it's done in a proper way, avoiding duplication. But for us, it's also a way to ensure that there is enough expertise at the right moment and at the right place. I mean, we are all facing now limitations in terms of resources, in terms of experts, and with as a result that experts today have to do a bit of everything. And finally, we see also an important link with internationalization. We are trading worldwide, and this is true for organics and inorganics. So having some harmonization at global level on assessment aspects is, of course, at most welcomed. Now, the question is the how, and I think Jack mentioned already key aspects here. There are aspects related to data and methodologies. He mentioned that. And then there are those aspects about coordination and communication. And I would like to start with the latter ones without repeating what Jack has been saying. But in the consultation that we had last week about the chemical strategy for sustainability, we really saw also at industry level that those aspects of coordination and communications are really key challenges to move to an OZOA, to ensure that we have a common understanding, but also that we basically can all participate in what would make sense. So key for success, I would say, is for us a clear formulation of the priorities to be addressed, a clear scoping of the assessments as well. I think Jack said that. But the question is basically, what are the concerns that we want to address when we are assessing a substance or a group of substances? Another, and then I'm going more to risk management, is indeed what are the regulatory options that we have to address those concerns? And we are thinking here about using the regulatory management option analysis concept early enough, actually, in the process to identify data needs, but also what has already been done in the past or elsewhere, and then who should be involved. So for us, it may be easier, it seems easier if we can have a kind of tool like RMOA to be able to plan and coordinate the different parts of the assessments, and then assign responsibilities. Now, of course, as industry, what we would like to be as well is being involved, and that risk cooperation. And we see that as a way to ensure that the system is functioning, but also that we continue to ensure capacity building of all the actors in the system. And that's why, although we realize that governance will be in policy hands, I mean, it's quite important as well that stakeholders remain informed and remain involved. Now, briefly on the data, I mean, we support all the efforts that can be done to have accessible data in a standardized format, because for us, it will limit basically the differences that you may have in data selection rules or uses. Think about AP data, biomonitoring data. It will also facilitate the acceptance of data between committees and agencies. The thing we need to think about it, and I suppose we will come back to it in the discussion, is about how we would then generate some data that may be missing to fulfill some specific requirements. And I'm thinking here about socioeconomic data or data on other sustainability aspects. And the question is where to report that in an efficient way. Can we involve OECD to make the link with the international work? And then on the last bit is really about the methodologies and the scientific principles. It would be great if there could be some more reflection about how to have more consistency on key topics, you know, those like weight of evidence, handling of uncertainty, transparency, and so on. So to conclude, we really see a huge value in striving to OZOA. We really would like to be able to work also with the authorities to strive towards something that would make the best use of what is already being done.
Okay, thanks, Theo. And some interesting points there on all aspects of that, from the risk assessment, risk management, and the data piece. We will indeed come back to those. Hans, you've heard kind of the other three speakers, so you have the either enviable or unenviable task of just kind of giving a reflection on what you've heard. And I suppose the interesting thing for me about your perspective is that perspective that bridges both the kind of European level and the national level. And I'd be interested in your personal perspective, listening to what the other guys have said on the phone.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot. I'm glad to hear that there's a lot of support for the system. The Netherlands recently supported a Danish initiative to have one website where all information on endocrine disrupting substances is located. And that makes sense because for public and also for companies, it's logic to have a clear overview what substance is identified as such. And if you look at the one substance, one assessment, it's kind of similar. For many people, it doesn't really matter whether it's a food contact material or a biocide or a regular chemical. They want to know what the properties are and what the risks are and whether you can use it safely. And therefore I see that there's a lot of logic. And also I think the argument which was mentioned that you need a lot of scientific knowledge to be able to assess a wide range of chemicals is also a reason why there is a clear benefit of harmonizing the assessment and having one very specialized agency. So there's many advantages. It's even, I think, an efficiency issue. The fact that there's in parallel the same substance being analyzed by different agencies more or less in the same time is more work for the company involved and more work for the agencies and for the member states evaluating. As to the disadvantage, as at least the things we need to overcome is there's of course at this moment a clear difference in data requirements depending on which legislation you refer to, and this is something where you would need some more harmonization. At the same time, and that probably needs also possibly an amendment of legislation. And from an organizatoric perspective, I mean, I would say that ECHA would be perfectly equipped to do this, but EFSA or maybe other agencies might have the same claim. So we would need to make also a kind of assessment where to evaluate, and that is very important because if more or less similar substances are analyzed by different organizations or different agencies coming to a different result, then there will always be this buzz. Is it because the agency did it differently, or is it because it's really a different outcome? So those are things we need to properly assess and decide upon before we can make this work.
Thank you, Hans. I think you picked up on a number of things I'm sure are going to come up in a minute about it's okay to say we're going to have one substance, one assessment, but who does it? And the competing agencies that are out there, sometimes with overlap, sometimes with very defined roles. I think there's a big question over that. And thank you also for talking about the different data requirements. We're going to come back to that in a moment. There are questions and commentary coming in, and I'm just going to pick out a few. I mean, interestingly, different points of view as well. So Axel Singhofen, Green Advisor, of course, in the European Parliament for many years on these kind of subject matters, thinks we're going a little bit back to the past with this whole idea of front loading the system, which will only result in massive delays. Slightly, I mean, maybe a different side of that story in terms of prioritizing and thinking about it. We have Juha Parkkinen, who's messaged in to say an example from RoHS, nickel sulfate. So I'm guessing something that Kevin and Via probably know quite well, was proposed to be added to RoHS. There's no nickel sulfate present in any electrical device due to the fact that it can't. Okay, bit of technical stuff. It's just not present. So in summary, we're looking at. We've been spending our time looking at a substance for a use that actually you're probably not an end user probably not going to find it in. Which I'm going to take the taxpayer's hat on there for a minute. I'm not sure I like my taxpayers' money being spent on doing stuff like that. Maybe the kind of thing we're talking about at the front end avoids that kind of situation. Who knows? Who else have I got in there? I've got Anissa from the Mineral Wool Industry Association here in town, if I'm not mistaken. Actually, something I wanted to come on to. She's saying, look, great that we're talking about harmonization of scope and methodology of assessment, but what about in the implementation of the policies later on? That's something I wanted to come to. I'm going to leave it there and just look at the poll and say, so the poll that we had, we asked people on the line, there's now 132 of you, saying what is the greatest obstacle to achieving one substance, one assessment? 38% of you, you're going to love this, silos between different parts of the authorities. So I'm guessing there we're talking about the different departments, both within perhaps the commission, but also between the agencies, I'm guessing, right? 38% of you said different methodologies for assessment. So something I think has been mentioned, Hans mentioned there, are we looking at the same substance, just doing it in different ways? 26% of you said different political priorities in different areas and different policy areas. And you'll be happy to know, Jack, that actually we've got a complete belief that your work on IT formats and tools is paying dividends, because only 2% of the people said that would be the major obstacle. So it seems that the IT issue is not one at all. I don't know about you guys on the line, but IT is always my problem, and I'm surprised we haven't had an IT issue already on today's webinar. Let's just delve into a little bit of some of that. Let me start with the data question, see if we can tackle the data piece of it. So I think kind of interesting points around, you know, I think Hans, you raised it, Vio, you touched upon it, different data requirements for different pieces of legislation. So, you know, I'm interested in points of view. Is that easily overcomable? I think, Hans, you mentioned we might need legislative change to change that. Also, I'd be interested on the data side. I think people brought up the idea of of kind of one place where all the data is held, and that would be a useful thing to have. I think we've been talking about a data space, is the words that keep an open data space. I know it was discussed in recent months and years at various conferences I've been in. Perhaps, Jack, you didn't mention data so much. Your views on that, the data challenge, like getting all the data together and making sure it's the right data that we're all looking at in different bodies. How do you see that? Is that a real challenge?
Yeah, thanks. It's definitely an important point to look at and further develop. I'm not sure if it's really a huge challenge in the sense that you know, that it hinders us a lot in doing the assessment, or that a lot of let's say divergences relate to that. But there's definitely a need to bring things together into one place, maybe not necessarily one database, but at least a place where there is accessibility to the information. Of course, here we need to be a bit aware of the fact that we have an international activity already ongoing, of course, at the OECD level. And we are following that very closely, as well as following very closely the discussions which are currently taking place in the EU, based on a project which is financed by the European Parliament. So there's quite a lot of things ongoing to bring that data space ID to a next level. And I'm actually relatively confident that that is something which we can work out in the next years. The issue of, let's say, data requirements needs perhaps a little bit more discussion. Indeed, there are different data requirements, and therefore that can lead to different conclusions, for instance, on the hazard assessment. I think that's more an issue of making sure that data which have been generated somehow into different pieces of legislation are actually made accessible, at least from a legislative perspective, to other assessments following on at a later stage. Because I think that is very difficult to explain also to the general public, to say, well, you know, we do, for instance, we do an assessment on a certain biocide or pesticide, which has potentially quite high data requirements. And then later on that substance would come under another assessment, for instance, done in a normal way under REACH. And we would not be able to allow using the data which have been generated, whilst they would actually maybe indicate quite significant effects, for instance. That would be rather strange. And
Jack, you say not
changed.
Allowed. Is that a legal issue in terms
of because there are certain limitations, of course, in terms of legally being able to allow information which has been generated elsewhere. Very often, of course, a lot of the data in the end becomes public. So I'm not saying that it's a big issue every time, but there can be cases where that's a problem.
Via, can I turn to you on that point then? This idea of the open data thing. So, I mean, I look back to the last couple of years, we've seen a revision of general food law where data transparency and open data, we've actually seen companies in that space and in the crop science space increasingly put data related to regulatory submissions on websites and make them very, very publicly available. Do you see that as the direction of travel? Do you see like more of this data being centralized? I can see it being made available maybe with legislative change for different regulatory processes, but the kind of, do we make it, is that going to enhance trust? We need to make more of the safety data available publicly as well? And also can you touch upon the thing that Jack mentioned about the interplay between different regulatory processes and where data is made available? I mean, I think certainly about things between biocides and REACH, and you know, the kind of the biocidal tail wagging the REACH dog almost. Any comments on either of those points?
Yeah, I like the image, but yeah, I think that's the journey to go. And as said by Jack, I think that what is important probably is to have a format that's understandable and usable by the different people involved in this, and that can be made publicly available at some point. And I see really that there is a change in mentality over the last years about the need to be quite transparent about what is done, and this is true as well in the inorganic sector, about safety levels, about the type of data we need to collect. In the organics, we really have a challenge to collect more information on the uses and where emissions are occurring along the life cycle. And I see that these are efforts that are basically key also to be able to do OZOA at some point, and where people have less of an issue to really communicate transparently about that. So having a format, and I think Euclid, without naming it, is really something that's already a very good starting point that could also work internationally. Having Euclid made really fit for purpose further, because it's a lively thing, could certainly be a solution and be the basis also for further communicating transparently.
Okay. Thanks. Let's move. I'm going to move the discussion on a little bit from data halfway into this and talk. Let's just talk about the things that Hans, I think you referred to, about which of the bodies that would be involved in this, and it came up in the poll, the kind of silo questions. Kind of, it seems to be the European Union has created the Chemicals Agency. It seems to have a central role. From my kind of layman's perspective, it would be the obvious place where, for a central body of the kind of risk assessment, we're already seeing a bit of that in the way that we've adapted the CAD and the CMD on the worker safety side, and I suppose the biocides that we've rolled in. We're now seeing ECHA taking on more responsibility for waste. We've seen Jack's executive director talk about other areas that ECHA might get involved in the future. Kind of, what do you see as the constellation between the different agencies that are already out there, and actually some scientific committees, and actually we should say, I mean, Kevin referred to Ross, we do in some processes have external contractors doing in effect risk assessments for the Commission. I mean, I'd be interested, Hans, your view on that constellation of how we would tackle that. Is there a logical way to align all of those different bodies that we currently have?
Yeah, if I in addition to what you mentioned, there's also work ECHA is now taking up on drinking water directive, on POPs, and on occupational health and safety. So that it is true that there's already a concentration of chemicals assessment going towards ECHA, and quite clearly I'm happy with this concentration, and also happy with the way it's not because Jack is on the line, but quite happy with the way ECHA is doing all these tasks. I do think that they're doing a very thorough job. At the same time, on the other side of the perspective, there's the Food Safety Agency, which or authority, I should say, Food Safety Authority, and they are doing the pesticides evaluations, a number of other evaluations. So there's also a whole system and a whole a knowledge base on that side. So I don't think it will be that easy to merge. There might also be like people working with ECHA might have trust in the way ECHA is performing. People who are working with EFSA might have preference for EFSA taking up issues. So that I do think it will need some discussion, and also we need to think whether we will put everything really in one agency, or whether we would, for instance, still have certain aspects done by the authority and others by the Chemicals Agency. What's very important was a point I would like to come back to as well. Is one of the comments from the room from Axel Singhoven, that is what we should not do is create a system which delays assessment, and I fully agree with that notion. I mean, this should not be a way of overburdening an agency with information which makes it so complicated that an assessment will take forever before to finalize. So that is something we need to take into account. I don't think that would necessarily happen, but it is something we need to take into account.
Okay, I hear you, Hans. Jack wanted to come in, and actually, Jack, I was going to go to Kevin because I want to bring him on the question of the different agencies. But Jack, you had your hand up. I guess you wanted to come in at a point. My question about the delay factor was actually, I mean, I hear mumblings already on the occupational worker safety side that that ECHA just doesn't have the capacity to do more actually, and that actually things might be slowing down now. I know that actually not lots of substances went through the previous CMD and CAD processes over the last 20 years, but But is there a fear that actually that this could all become too much for one agency, and that might be the thing that leads us to a slowing down of assessment?
Well, first of all, on the last one, I think that's absolutely incorrect. I think we've been doing exactly what we were tasked for by DG Employment in terms of timing as well as number of substances. So there's no problem in terms of delays. I mean, it's a matter of what kind of requests we have received over time, and again, what we have received, we've done in line with the requirements. So that is a misunderstanding which I would really like to take away. The more general point is, of course, that there's no doubt that the most efficient thing is to just give something to one agency, either EFSA or ECHA, let them do the work and not get anyone involved in that. That is by definition the fastest, because as soon as you have more people, more experts, more committees involved, and you need to coordinate and work together, of course that's going to create more work, more need for interaction, possibilities for different views, which need to be taken into account. That's very clear. And that's also what we've been discussing actually clearly with EFSA. For areas where it's clear who's best in doing what, don't touch them, just leave them as they are. It's more complicated when you have actually substances where you know actually that they are having significant parts of their use covered by different legislations. I mean, food contact materials is a typical one, but there are others. And there you will either need to decide to change, and that needs then a change in the legislative situation, or you need to really work on coordination and making sure that the right people, right expertise is involved in doing the assessments. But this is also where I was saying earlier that then there's an absolute need to be clear from the start what the scope of the assessment is, to make sure that it actually is holistic and not taking only a small part of the use, draw a conclusion, and then later on draw a conclusion on another part, and by definition you're wrong then. But also make sure that actually you involve the right people and coordinate and look at the timing. One hazard assessment is already one big step here, I think. And this is where, for instance, we also agreed with EFSA that also for pesticides, biocides, but potentially also other chemicals, combining hazard assessment and drawing a clear conclusion on the classification and labeling, we have a body dealing with that who has experience, and it's more efficient to let them do that work. But then we have to make sure that all the information is there, so that we have everything on the table, so that the classification and the hazard assessment is done in an appropriate manner, and that can then be taken on further into the risk assessments, potentially done by other bodies. As long as it's then very clear that that information is a starting point for the next actions to take. I think that's basically what we've been saying all the time.
I was hoping to bring Kevin in, but I think he's just dropped off.
He's gone.
He's dropped off. And Jack, I gave you the floor when Kevin decided to leave.
Sorry.
We won't do that again. But since you made reference to the hazard assessment and CLH, I just kind of, one thing I noted, I suppose, and one of the areas where ECHA has taken a role in recent years is the biocidal piece. There is clearly timelines in some legislation which kind of force things along quicker than in other pieces of legislation. I mean, how do we, I'm particularly thinking the biocidal thing, where I think you have a certain amount of time, right? And they've got review programs already in place that have to be met. It seems to me from what I've seen that forces stuff along and perhaps already creates some kind of tension between processes that might be better phased in a different way. How do you do that? How do you sort that out in this one substance, one assessment? Does that require the legislative change that Hans referred to get some kind of logical sequencing into how we look at these assessments?
That's not so much the case, I think, because indeed, since we have the biocides process and CLH processes under the same roof, we are, I think, internally at least, as far as I know, quite well coordinating. We can make sure that once a member state needs to do a hazard assessment for biocides as part of the active substance review, that they also make sure that actually the CLH is properly done and timely submitted into the process. And we've set up the rules for that and the procedures. And the same we've done actually with pesticides and EFSA. It has taken a bit of time, but I think now we have a quite smoothly running processes where even though the legislative timelines are even not the same, we still managed to get the harmonized classification done in time so that EFSA can do its hazard assessment and risk assessment on the basis of that, and send the final conclusions to the Commission. So that's working quite well, but it needs definitely time and coordination. But the point is, the point you're making is of course right, that some of these processes are dictated by the timelines given, for instance, in review regulations. And that is what I was saying earlier. Then if we know this, we have to be very well aware that some of these things are coming to us at a certain point in time, and be aware that if, for instance, there's a substance there which also has other uses potentially covered by other pieces of legislation, could be cosmetics or whatever, then we ensure that actually those bodies are actually not doing assessments in an inappropriate time compared to what's already coming up from a legislative point of view. I'm
gonna give Kevin more time to come back so I can ask him about the different bodies, but maybe we'll stay on that planning and processing piece, VO, with you for a second. So this idea at the beginning, we need a better system at the beginning of all of these different processes to give a bit of what I'm guessing you would like from an industry perspective, predictability about what's going to happen when, and planning, because I'm also conscious that industry has resource constraints, not just institutions, in terms of an industry as an actor in some way in these processes. How do you see that planning piece? So I noticed that ECHA has invested time in the ACT tool, I think it's called, isn't it, and PACT for the public side of it. Is that kind of thing working? Is that something we need to build upon? And does that give you, I mean, some great, ECHA's invested clearly lots of time in website to enable us to all go and find the information we require. Is that working as a kind of planning piece for you? Can you see what's coming down the line when you look at some of the products that are in your portfolio at Eurometaux?
Yeah, it works, at least in part, and I think this is partly, well, that's part of the solution also to ensure that there is timely involvement, but also timely data generation for what we would like to do. I think again, I mean, and of course I'm going back with the RMOA thinking, but again, and I understand the fear that we go to a system that would be so massive and so huge that everything is delayed. But if we could really address the concerns upfront for a substance or a group of substances, because grouping is now really something that we need to consider in this context as well. If we could define upfront what the concerns are and then see what are the different tracks we need to follow, this may facilitate also somehow basically what to select in terms of responsibilities, priorities, and also allow existing committees to continue to function. I mean, the idea is not to recreate a super agency of everything. Now, PACT, yes, definitely, but we could make more of it. If we had such a kind of RMOA-like thinking, it doesn't need to be called RMOA, but if we have some reflection at the start, we could have that announced also on PACT and give a limited timeline also to generate the data that we would need in addition to what is, for example, available in other legislations or in registration dossiers, to really allow that kind of move towards the further steps of the assessments. So again, this is something I see in terms of coordination as being not a magic trick, but something that could facilitate the process and also allow, and again, we are talking a lot about silo working at authorities level. There is also silo working at industry level. Let's not be blind. So we need also to bring the people together to reflect about the different uses, different expertises, and that requires a bit of time. So that's part of the process as well.
Hans, I want to bring you in on that with your two different hats on this idea of more planning. So building on PACT and maybe we've wandered a little bit into the risk management area with the reference to RMOAs. Can never say that. Glad, by the way, Kevin, that you're back. I joked about technical difficulties and then you had one. Shouldn't have probably done that. That question of preparing in advance and kind of allowing, because I think that predictability, that prepping is about the regulatory processes and different people within different agencies, but it's also about industry, and it's about, I think it's at the core, right, of what every industry acts for: predictability, certainty. Tell me when things are going to happen, give me that, and I can plan against it. That's all I need is general refrain from every industry person you've ever spoken to. I'm interested though, like, how do you see that? And can we think differently about that is my question. So we're still talking very much about substance by substance and grouped by different endpoints or whatever we're talking mechanisms, right? We're still taking a very chemical policy centric view of the world. Yet this strategy that's coming out is supposed to be led by Green Deal. So what I thought was interesting by Bjorn Hansen's statements recently is the expansion of thinking beyond the pure chemical management into this broader thinking. And my question is, Hans, should we be a bit more like that in how we prioritize? So if chemicals are giving signals to industries to invest or not on chemical reg is, could we start looking at a more value chain approach? Could we start saying, well, let's have that kind of pathway for critical chemicals that affect, I don't know, let's say batteries, VO, right? Could we take a different approach? And I'll come back to Kevin on the question that I've been waiting to ask him before he drops off. Hans, different kinds of ways of prioritizing and grouping.
Yeah, but I mean, first of all, it is always important if you discuss substances of very high concern and you look at the alternatives. It's not just chemical alternatives; it might also be different techniques. If you want a certain functionality, sometimes you can also reach it by non-chemical means. That might not be the preference of a large part of the audience, but I mean that is also a way to look at it, and that's also stated in the letter, which also goes into Safe by Design, which has been sent a couple of days ago by 10 ministers to the European Commission on safe chemicals for the future. So there are different ways of looking at it. When it comes to prioritization, I mean, at the moment in legislation, there are what you already mentioned, time frames, and then it's quite simple. Also, looking at the comments from the room, the time frame you need to respect is the earliest one. And potentially, if you talk about one assessment for one product, it can be that if at this moment it's also only used as a base chemical, and then 4 years from now it will also be used as a food contact material, that might involve a new assessment of that same chemical, but taking into account a different kind of use. So that
get you a kind of iterative process, that you can't. We can't expect certainty, and after a certain date, nothing happens. I guess.
But the concept of risk management option analysis, I mean, that's a concept where analysis is really in favor. We've advocated it in many occasions, and that would be even better equipped, better possible if we go to the system of one substance, one assessment. But you still, again, need to respect the at this moment the boundaries of each legislation where it comes from, and about amending the legislation. In some cases, even the legislation refers to the agency assessing it. And for instance, if biocidal products, if we decide that biocidal products could be better assessed by EFSA than by ECHA, or vice versa, then already that might need an amendment of legislation. So we do need to look at the whole package. But I think it's really important to see it for the predictability, also for the industry, to have a robust assessment, know what kind of information and how it's assessed and what time frame. And then it's both for public authorities and for industry predictable when they will be assessed, how the product will be assessed, and what is the timeline for result.
Okay, thanks, Hans. Kevin, I'm going to come back to you. I'm going to allow you 2 bites of the cherry because we lost you for a minute in the internet wilderness.
Thank you.
So first of all, I mean, anything you've heard about that predictability story, about like how you and actually your members, right, who are global companies, invest all over the world, like, what kind of what would you see in this kind of world that would give you the kind of predictability for your members to continue to invest in Europe? Because I'm guessing we all want that in this regulatory setting. Secondly, if I could just take you back to the point at which you exited the conversation, I know you've got a specific, your example that you gave at the beginning is very much about 2 different bodies looking at the same, 2 different risk assessors looking at the same point of view. And so I'd be interested in how you see that. And in particular, would you want to see a bigger role for ECHA in doing the RoHS assessments? I mean, very direct question.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a question, and I've been following the discussion on that. And I think at this point, it's probably more helpful to focus on what steps can we do now to get coordination going a bit better. I mean, I wrote down several bullet points before this, and I just heard some of them mentioned today. I mean, already I would say the key thing is to get coordination established between the owners of the different processes. So the different agencies, the Commission, the member states. I mean, sometimes the member states come out of nowhere and say, I'm going to put this substance into RoHS. Okay, fine. But, I think there needs to be a way that's done in a sort of coordinated way, and in a way in which industry can understand why that is being done. The predictability aspect of that. I think, something like a substance lead authority, of course, here's the governance issue coming out. And again, it's back to your question, do you just throw everything over to ECHA and say, you guys do it, or ECHA, EFSA, whatever? Look, it's something I think that will be debated over the next period, probably the next couple of years as we do that. But there's no doubt that as Hans and Jack have said, that what we need is efficiency here, and that's efficiency both for administrations and efficiency for industry as well. As Theo said, resources are scarce. And then I think, for the risk management decision, and I want to sort of also join back to the comment from Axel on this. I mean, I think, Axel, just speaking to you directly, this is not and should not be seen as any attempt to go backwards. No, the question of timing and process and things being done efficiently is a general issue. I could even tell you that in one of our situations, we started with a timetable, and now that timetable in that particular assessment is 18 months behind schedule. That's not our fault. Okay, that's not our fault. That is simply because the process is as it is. It wasn't time bound. It's not as robust and for instance as some of the ECHA processes are, which are time bound. But even if processes are time bound, you get opinions coming from ECHA, for instance, for some restrictions or authorizations and so on. The risk managers take over. The risk managers are the politicians. It's the political level, and we have no influence over what they do in making that time. Of course, stakeholders will make their cases and so on this. But I think the timing question is a very important question. It should not be seen as one where somebody's trying to put brakes on something. No, I think we should look at timing in the context of the efficiency aspect. It's part of that process. And then James, I think, sorry, because you asked me two questions now, I forgot the first
the other one was the two bodies that you've got risk assessment, you've got a substance evaluation and a RoHS situation at the same time. And I just wanted your reflections on what you learned from that in terms of how you see different risk management, risk assessment processes taking place.
Yeah, well, I think there's two aspects to that. One is the gap in terms of methodological robustness as a first point. That was pointed out at the beginning, and it didn't improve, and we're left with that. The other point is to connect it with what I just said is timing. That assessment started out, but now all of a sudden it's crashing into the REACH evaluation. It's overlapping it. So we're and as I said, we're faced with a situation now where it's saying, oh, there is a REACH evaluation. It's going to produce information on this. Maybe we should wait. Yes, of course we should wait until we have that information. That information is very germane to that discussion, and that's again an example of where the things are. So
a bit more planning there might have gone a long way.
Hindsight's a great thing, and I would say that yes. I do have some of my membership who'd say, well, hold on a second, this substance was assessed back in 2012, 2014, and it was put forward again. What was the new information that drove that? What was the new information that drove? There wasn't new information because the new information is being generated under REACH.
Okay, Thank you, Kevin. We're drawing to the end. I wanted to ask you about, we touched a little bit on the risk management side. I wanted to ask you about the ideas about could we use reach restrictions for everything, which I heard last webinar last week from Mr. Hansen. But we'll leave that for now, because I just want to take the last few minutes. Stein from European Copper mentioned that Jack, you talked about the legal obstacles to one substance, one assessment being potentially key. And I think, Hans, you referred to, we might need to change, for example, in different pieces of legislation, we might need to change the authorities or the agencies that are reviewing or are doing the risk assessments. I was just interested, maybe just to end up in the last couple of minutes, just from each of you, like to get to this lovely world of one substance, one assessment, without, with due respect to making sure that things still happen efficiently and making sure Axel feels happy as well, and it doesn't slow things down. If we were to end up in this place that's more efficient, that's more coordinated, more coherent, what's the one thing that each of you would see as the biggest barrier that we'd have to overcome? And how would you overcome it? So we're now, let's pretend we're not ECHA, Management Board, Det Netherlands, BSEF, or Eurometaux. Let's pretend we're the chemicals unit of DG Environment for a moment. What's the thing we'd be putting in that communication about the essential thing we need to get right on one substance, one assessment in order to get this going? I'm going to start with Jack, I think. What's the one thing you'd put in that communication, Jack? I know you're not allowed, but pretend you are.
Well, there's many indeed, but if I have to choose one, I would definitely start with, on the one hand, perhaps also the easiest one, having one hazard assessment and ensuring that we do classification, harmonized classification and labeling for each substance which actually enters what I would say, the legislative processes under various legislations in the EU, so that we ensure that actually that we have a good starting point for everyone else. There's a lot more to say, but we don't have the time for that.
Okay, but a good point. So irrespective of which of these processes we're talking about, we start with harmonized hazard classification. Good. Okay. Vio, you're next on my screen, so I'm going to you.
Yeah, so I would agree with the hazard identification as being the first step. I think another thing that could be useful, because the exercise between ECHA and EFSA was very useful, but could be extended. I would do a kind of review of the available resources and committees we have to date, also to reassure everyone about the fact that expertise will be acknowledged along the process.
Perfect, thank you. Hans, you're next on my screen.
I would have a different take on this. I would put in my communication that building trust would be key. You would need to amend quite a number of things, quite a lot on the organization, and people need to be very confident that this will really improve the system. So the key thing for me to get to one substance, one assessment is that we build trust, and that would be within agencies, but also within governments, within industry, and last but not least within European Parliament, that it would be an improvement.
Okay, thanks, Hans. Kevin, the final words with you, sir.
Yeah, well, I'll just go back to one of the bullets I mentioned earlier, and I think this might be something that will flow out of the discussion once the strategy emerges, and once this particular aspect is looked at in great detail. And that is, right now we can get coordination between the different processes going by having the different owners of those processes, whether it's member states, whether it's the Commission or agencies such as EFSA, talking together. I think, Hans, this builds on your point about building trust. It's about understanding each other's role, not just looking at the piece of legislation and saying that's them. Actually understanding what the other party does and what they can bring to this. That would be a great help. I also think that, and I know the Commission has mooted, at least you see it in EU issue tracker, which is sometimes telling us more than we can ever know for sometimes about things. But there is some noises about moving administratively in the short term to address some of the concerns that we have. For instance, if we take reach evaluation and RoHS, one option there is to reopen and look at the memorandum, the common understanding paper which is there between reach and RoHS. And then there's other ideas like that. So in other words, it's softer, but at least it brings the discussion to a point where you can actually, you know, put down some guidelines, and then of course in the medium and longer term, start to look at the broader, bigger question about, okay, if you're taking a big governance step in this area, who's going to be in charge? What are the processes, etc.? So that would be my thing. It would be to try to maybe look at it as a journey rather than a destination straight away tomorrow. Let's take small steps and move things along without, because you have to bring everybody with you. I think that would be another thing. You have to bring different organizations, different cultures as well along with you. So that would be my suggestion.
Thank you, Kevin. I mean, I'll summarize there. I mean, our poll at the beginning talked about the biggest challenge being silos. I mean, one observation I would have is clearly the system we have has developed over many, many years, and for good and bad reasons, right? And maybe if we were to start from fresh, we wouldn't exactly create the system we have, and that puts stakeholders in different positions and different processes interacting. But what I took from all of you there was a kind of stepwise approach that, as Kevin said, direction of travel is clear. We want more consistency, we want more predictability, we want more efficiency actually in the system. I don't think anyone disagreed with that, but perhaps it's an organic thing, and perhaps those first steps that all of you have mentioned are the right first steps in getting to it. And perhaps we shouldn't expect from what I'm sure will be a groundbreaking communication in September that it's going to solve all of our problems in the first year, that this may be a process and a debate for a number of years to come. Listen, I'd like to thank you all for participating, those of you who are in Brussels and in other parts of Europe today. Thanks all to the panelists who've participated and given their views. It's been a delight to have you. I would happily continue the conversation. I think from the chat, there was a number of people who would have happily done so too. I'll end with wishing you a very pleasant sunny afternoon if you happen to be in Brussels. And also just remind you, stay safe. Stay socially distance. Take care of yourself.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good.
Till the next
Thank you. Thank you, James.
Thanks a lot.
Bye bye. Thank you. Bye bye. Bye bye.